I had all of this cool stuff figured out, but you find me?
I did.
Can you hear me?
No, yeah. I turned myself down because I didn't want things to be
Okay. Fantastic. So good morning. Welcome to Faithcast. I'm Pastor Keith. I don't need any of this on today because all of this is set up. I had this really cool intro all figured out, had it planned. There was a little countdown clock. None of it worked this morning. So, but that's okay because we're rolling. It's 9 o'clock. Everybody that's here, God bless you. We are going to continue our one-sided discussion because, well, to talk, you guys can comment in the live chat if you would like to. You can always make comments on the videos afterwards. They will be on the YouTube channel. And in fact, I've interacted with one or two people already and had some, interesting thoughts. But today, we are continuing along with understanding, are we a Christian nation? And I need to start out with a little bit of a caveat today. I was listening to a conservative talk show YouTuber, and he was talking about the Socratic method, and I'm not going to get into what all of it is, but the one thing he was talking about on it is that you have to admit your biases. You have to acknowledge if you are biased on a topic if you're going to have an honest discussion about it. And so when I'm going through this series, and we have 2 weeks after today on Are We a Christian Nation? My personal bias is that yes, we are technically a Christian nation. And remember the very first episode, I said you could argue it either way depending on how you want to look at it. And we're going to finish up with that same argument in the last episode in 2 weeks. But I need to be honest and say, look, as I'm going through all this, because I've done the studies, I've done the history on it, I've looked at every aspect of it, and yes, because I'm a Christian, I can say that we are very, very much influenced as a Christian nation. And I don't want to give much away from the 2 weeks from now, the final episode, but we are seeing a repeat of history in the idea of where we are as a faith in the manner of how our history is trying to be eliminated today, in the name of racism and issues that exist. I don't believe as dramatically as many would have you believe, but that's a political topic for another episode. But today, continuing with the historical look of how Christianity influenced the beginning of the United States. We started all the way back with King Henry VIII and his dispute with the Pope, and everything that's been since then has brought us to this point now where, for the discussion today, we are just before the Revolutionary War. We are in the early 1700s, 1740s, 1750s, and there are two significant things that happened in history at this point, which really pushed Christianity into an influence of us forming as a nation. The first one was the 7 Years' War, or in America, we call it the French Indian War. We don't do much history on it. You don't learn much about it in school, which is sad because it has such an influence. This is where most people, if I'm being honest and having the discussion, this is where people get confused, because this is where you first learn about George Washington. He's a young general. He's like in his early 20s, serving the British Army. And you hear about his travels up through western Pennsylvania into what is now Pittsburgh, and all the way up into Erie, and what is a little town called Fort LaBeouf, which was a fort that Washington visited. And And people get confused because they think that's all part of the Revolutionary time, because that's when they know George Washington. But this is back when the 7 Years' War, which a lot of people call the actual First World War. And I'm not going to get into a huge discussion about why it was so bad or why they were all fighting with each other and all the different countries that came into play. I want to talk about just a couple very specific things that influenced the civilian life of the colonists as the 7 Years' War ended. And that is, so they'd gone to war against the French. The English were always fighting the French back then. They hated each other. And several of the Indian nations, the United States, North America, I should say, were involved. Spain was involved. But part of this argument, part of this fight of the French-Indian War was the fact that British colonists had moved westward from the original colonies. And it's interesting, if you look at the original maps, like Virginia didn't end where Virginia, if you know Virginia as a state today, in 2020, Virginia just sort of had the north and south border and the east border of the coast, but then it just sort of went to infinity because they didn't even know what all the land was beyond that. So there were these British settlers that were moving westward, but the French owned, see, that's where the word, we have to not use the word owned, occupied parts of North America from Canada, what we know as Canada now, and then down through the southern part of the Great Lakes. And so there was this conflict between who had authority of it. So big fighting, blah, blah, blah. They finally come to a treaty in Paris. And in the resolution, all this land was divided up by all the powerful nations. The non-powerful nations, like the Native Americans, were essentially given nothing. But the one thing that happened was, and I say essentially nothing, because the British colonists had been fighting for that westward movement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And we could talk, let's just use Western Pennsylvania and into the Ohio Valley is really what we're talking about. But when everything settled, the dust had cleared, that land was given to the Native Americans. And basically it was the British colonists would not go beyond the Appalachian Islands. And they didn't agree with it and were pretty upset because their attitude was, we just fought for that land. We just took it away from the French. And now in a treaty that we didn't get to be a part of because we're not even a nation, we're just colonists under British rule, the crown over on the other side of the pond just gave all of this to the Native Americans that we're not getting along with. And I'm not going to get into a huge debate about it, but the Native Americans were not always the peace-loving victims that we all want to say that they were. They had a side to themselves as well. Although the British colonists historically had a much worse side when it came to getting along. So anyhow, the British colonists are like, well, this is not cool. We want that land. So they just sort of ignored the crown. They ignored the ruling and they just kept pushing forward, which created more conflicts between the colonists and the Native Americans. Okay. So that's the mindset right now of the British colonists here in the 13 colonies are upset with the decisions of the crown because of the land that they were not given, that they fought for. And now they're ignoring the rules of the British monarchy. Okay? That all makes sense? Okay. Kathy's over there nodding. Yes, that makes sense.
Makes sense.
Okay. So here's the second thing that was happening in history. And it's interesting because it's, for me, looking at it, and watching culture today, it's almost like history repeating itself. During this time of colonial growth, if you watch the last episode or you go back and listen to the last episode, I talked about how there was a combination between a Christian growth. Certain parts of the colonies were all about their faith. That's why they were here. You can't discount that. You cannot say that they did not come here for Christian values. It was the Protestant Reformation, and we know that certain parts of the colonies came for religious freedom from the crown, but to live primarily in a religious order. Other parts of the colonies had become more secular, more about money. And we have that argument. You can only serve one master, right? God or money. And when we get to next week, we're going to talk about that a little bit, sort of how the writing of our U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights as it played into it was sort of the first civil war between the colonies. But so as the secular movement started to happen, more and more, they called it mercantilism. It was the idea of trading of goods, and it was working out well for the British Crown. This is why the British Crown had, right, these lands all around, was for the trading, buying, and selling of goods. It was all about money. And the colonies were no different to the Crown. And as all of this was happening over the decades, spiritual life became stagnant and didn't have as much of a play in society. In fact, it was sort of getting pushed out because along with all this mercantilism and buying and selling of goods and all about money, was in France a movement had started called the Enlightenment. I forgot to mention this earlier. And the Enlightenment was, and this is how part of this plays into today. Still with me here, Kathy? Okay. So you got the mindset of the colonists from the French and Indian War. Okay. Then you have the Enlightenment, which is spreading from France to other parts of the world, including the colonies. And Enlightenment was the movement of science and reason for things, which in the idea of the Enlightenment was science and reason, religion was downplayed. We see that today, except we see it in a really, really bad way because it's, and I'm going to say that right now in this 21st century, the year 2020, it's sort of an attitude of the Enlightenment. We want to talk about science and reason, and we want to downplay religion. We want to eliminate religion. In fact, I remember having an argument with a young lady about abortion, and she said, if you would just give up your beliefs, everything would be okay. The problem is the movement today doesn't have the same scientific foundation of actually looking at science and reason. Because when you really look at the foundation of science and reason, Christianity plays a bigger role in it rather than being downplayed. And I want you to remember I said that because in 2 weeks, I'm really going to talk about that. But in the idea of the colonists and us building as a nation, the Enlightenment is coming along. And so science and reason and westward movement and money is all starting to overtake everything, and religion is being more and more downplayed. And came the Great Awakening, which was a religious movement. It was a revival that saw huge growth in the church in the colonies. And not just from, and we look at the northern, starting in the north where it started out with the Puritans, right? We're looking at the Presbyterian churches, the talkings of John Calvin, who was a great theologian. And he talked about predestination. And then going forward, right, we get down into Pennsylvania, and we have the Quakers and their pacifist living. But then when we start to get farther and farther south, we're looking at the Anglican Church. A lot of the southern colonies are still holding on to the Church of England, which is important to remember because next week that comes into play. But these great theologians start to make this movement across the colonies and coming and preaching. And we see different denominations like the Methodist Church with John Wesley coming over, and they'd have circuit riders and people preaching the gospel. George Whitefield is probably the most famous pastor in the Great Awakening. I mean, he traveled all around the colonies talking about the love of God. And here's the thing. Take a quick drink here, because this is what's really, really cool, is they were taking the fire and brimstone and the wrath of God and not just diminishing, and we shouldn't do that today. I mean, God's judgment exists, but back then there was always just this fear of God. I mean, and just probably one reason people stop going to church. If you're just going to show up every Sunday and be told how horrible you are and that you're going to burn in the fires of hell, why would you go every week just to hear that? And so George Whitefield talked about a lot of the preaching that we hear today is that there is God's love and there is redemption, and that you can have a personal relationship with God if you're truly willing to read his word, to actually get into the Bible, to study it, to know it, and to see how it applies contextually to your life. This is what he was preaching back then. This is what we preach today. And this is what he was preaching back then. And it took fire, and it spread across the colonies that people were hungry for this. They wanted to know that there was more to their existence than just the fur trade. And isn't that really where a lot of us are at today? That you want to know that there's more to life than just going to work, getting a paycheck, retiring, and dying. That you have some greater purpose in that. And the Great Awakening showed the colonists that through God's word, you were worth so much more than that. God's love was so much. I mean, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was so powerful in the understanding that they had. And yeah, I sort of wanted to share a few like messages and stories of George Whitefield today, but it would have taken much longer than the 30 minutes we have. But I would urge you to go and look at the studies of the Great Awakening and the preachers back then, and the men and women that shared their faith. And this is why it's so important for us as a colony. Okay, I'm going to try and wrap this all up and bring it all back together, because it looks like I'm starting to bore Kathy.
You're not boring.
Is the idea that through all of this preaching, through all of this understanding of faith and the individual purpose, along with this attitude that had started to really percolate. I mean, it was really just bubbling. This angst that the colonists were starting to have against the crown, against the monarchy, because of the 7 Years' War. The colonists felt more empowered to be like, well, wait, I'm worth more than this. I am stronger than this. And here's the really, this is the tipping point. This is the one little moment. And now I hate myself because I can't remember the name of the tax. There were several taxes that the British Crown started to impose upon the colonists. We know about like the Boston Tea Party. We always see that as like the big movement of the revolution, right? The tax on the tea. But there were several taxes before then. And one of them, and maybe this is my challenge for you, if you're actually listening to me today with my messy hair. I hate that I can see myself on camera. If you're actually listening to me today with what's going on, look up the taxes that the British Crown started to impose upon the colonists prior to the American Revolution. Obviously prior to the Revolution, but after the French and Indian War. Because the colonists were just mad because they had just won this war that they were a part of. But then the crown gave the land that they fought for away. And then the crown imposed a tax on the colonists to pay for the debt that was incurred to fight for the land that they were now no longer allowed to have. So, yeah, if you ever wonder why the colonists like finally had this breaking point of that's it, we're done, it starts right here. We as a nation, we as a new country, if you want to know if Christianity played into it, it all happens right here at this moment in history in the 1750s, where the colonists have had this great awakening through the word of Jesus Christ, through the teachings of the preachers, this renewed sense of community. And interestingly, some historians, you go to history.com and they talk about this. I mean, this is not coming from, I got to clarify this because I know that some people will get upset. This is not coming from the standpoint of a religious bias. This is coming from the idea of social science, that the colonists through the Great Awakening had this, I can't say it was a renewed sense, but it was a new sense of nationalism, that they were independent. And it was because of the Great Awakening in reaction to the taxes that were being imposed on them by the crown. So if anybody wants to argue yes or no, we are a Christian nation, regardless of what happens specifically written in the U.S. Constitution. And yes, next week we're going to talk about the First Amendment. But this moment in history, this time, is exactly when Christianity helped to form us as a nation, because it was, without a doubt, across the board, from theology to sociology and anthropology, will all agree that the influences and the word of Jesus Christ gave the colonists the sense of individualism and strength and an idea of nationalism to make the move to stand up against a tyrannical British crown. That makes sense?
Sure.
Any questions on that? Kathy's over there typing away. I think she's shopping online. She's not even watching the episode.
Oh, I'm looking for some of the information you had.
Oh, Kathy is fact checking me in live time, which is absolutely fine. You know, I would ask people to fact check me. I do my research before I get on here. And that's really all I wanted to talk about today. I could have gone a little bit deeper into the French and Indian War. I could certainly go deeper into the Great Awakening and the religious movement, but I don't want to play too heavy on that. I just want to emphasize that one point, because that is the catalyst that starts to move our founding fathers to revolution. And, you know, it's interesting that George Washington, being one of those men, started out as a British officer and fought for that very land. I mean, if you, it's, and I have a book right here, actually, that talks about the faith of our fathers. This is what we're getting to. And, you know, it talks about Washington's faith, which, yes, he did have. In fact, he had an interesting fear of God. But he was the general who led so many troops up through Western Pennsylvania. The battles at Fort Duquesne, the battle at Fort Necessity, where General Braddock, right, was killed. And so Washington saw a lot of his men die under the orders of the British crown for land. And remember, he's still a colonist. He's serving here in the colonies as a British official. but he is certainly influenced by the world around him. Even though there's a hierarchy, certainly a class system. It's a class system that exists today. We just don't like to talk about it. But the difference is that the founding fathers had more of a connection to the agricultural community and to the lower classes than, honestly, I think a lot of our bureaucrats have today. Perfect example. I'm going to be political for just 1 second, not to be political, not to make sides, but to show a contrast of where we are between then and today, and why it's hard for people to really have a legitimate argument to say that we are not a Christian nation back then when you're trying to compare it to our leaders of today. George Washington fought for the British crown, for land, for Britain. He did exactly what he was supposed to do by his orders. However, he had such an understanding and such a relationship with the colonists themselves that he understood how they were being mistreated by the crown, and he empathized with it. So much so that he was willing to be one of the founding fathers to turn against the crown. Right? Think about that. How many military leaders today would stand up against their president or monarch and say, I'm not doing this because of the way you're treating these people, right? We don't see that today. Here's my one example, is probably the most corrupt politician in the history of the United States. I will argue in the history of the United States is a lady by the name of Maxine Waters, who serves one of the poorest regions of Los Angeles, but she lives in a $6 million mansion in a different district. She doesn't even live amongst the people that she says she's called to serve. So it's a great, to me, disservice to the sacrifices of our founding fathers when you're going to compare whether or not we are a Christian nation based on the absolute secularism of leaders today compared to the absolute standing of faith that our founding fathers had. And I will argue that with every single founding father, and we can say some of them would struggle with where they were with their Christianity. But when we look at it in depth, it's not because whether or not they believed in God, it's because of the struggles of the church, which is where people like me need to humble ourselves and realize that everything we say, every time I talk on here, when I go to the church later, every little part of what I do when I represent Jesus Christ is just one step away from pushing somebody away from God, which is what we absolutely don't want, which is why I'll share the facts. I will share God's love. And if you question it, cool, question it, but don't just discount it because you just want to find a reason to walk away. Because that is not the Socratic method. That is not living a mature godly life. That's just not living a mature life. So I'm a little wound up today about the whole thing. But that is our episode for today. I again apologize at the beginning of the episode didn't kick off as planned. I had some really cool technology all set up. If you're going to make it to church today, 11 a.m. at the Grange Hall up on Route 337, just south of Sandstone Springs, near the Heart's Content Road. And if you'd like to see a full church service, we have one premiering here on this YouTube channel. It's supposed to be at 11 o'clock, but because of YouTube's restrictions, it actually will premiere at 10:45. If you would like to support this ministry, please go to our website, tidioutecreek.org. And I think I have it listed in the comments section. I think I made a comment there. You can go to the link and help support this ministry. Other than that, I will see you all next week when we talk about a revolution of faith. Amen. All right. Have a good week, everybody. Bye.